Our scripture text today comes from the book of Exodus, the 22nd chapter, verses 25 through 27, and we hear these words for us this morning. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. And what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. May we share a word of prayer together. Loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. This coming January or so, this church will celebrate 31 years of relationship with our sister community in El Salvador, El Agarral. That's a pretty significant tenure of relationship to a community that is down in Central America. That community was identified early in this church's life as a community in which we would partner with. We call them our sister community. It's not a community that we are called to help. It's a community that we have a mutual relationship with one another. And if that relationship is a mutual relationship, that means there's this kind of loving back and forth, and there is mutual benefit, mutual admiration, mutual learning, mutual inspiration that happens by having that relationship with another community that's in a different part of the world, that has a different worldview, that has a different way of understanding how things work in the world. I had the blessing back this last January to travel with Jerry Doherty and Joe Nicholas to visit our sister community. And it was an eye-opening experience. I've mentioned it more than once, but particularly wanted to highlight a few things out of that experience for me, and maybe you, and there's many in this congregation that have made the trip and have traveled to El Agarral in El Salvador. One of the things that happens when we go, and Jerry or whoever is the group leader works with the community in advance so that when we're there in the community, that our group is hosted every meal at someone's house. Now, we start to picture house, and house in El Salvador is something very different. And when we go to a person's house to eat, we don't actually ever go inside their actual house. We usually eat on the covered porch just on the outside of their main living space. Now, the interesting thing, we were there, I think there was 11 meals that El Agarral hosted for the three of us when we were there, or hosted you when you went. And when Jerry was working on this list of who would host, the interesting thing about that experience was that there weren't enough, I guess there was more houses that wanted to host than could host for 11 meals. There was about 58 households in El Agarral, and only 11 got to host a meal. And it's almost like there was a battle for who got to host the group from St. Andrew when they arrived. And there was a sense of pride, there was a sense of connection, a sense of opportunity to get to meet and to serve. And regardless of the condition of their house or how much they had so much enthusiasm to provide the three of us a meal. We had eggs and refried beans and grilled plantains and tortillas at every meal. And as we would eat the meal, sometimes they would sit with us at the table, and sometimes they would just allow us to sit by ourselves. But I tried to pay attention without staring and looking, is pay attention to the faces of those who served or the households that hosted us at those locations. And I could not try to describe to you the big smile was on the faces that stretched from ear to ear as we sat in their homes and shared meal with those individuals. And then I mentioned maybe once before that kind of between the time period of about 4 to 6 or 3:30 to 5:30 there is a little community area in El Agarral. There's now a little park area. There's a covered gazebo. There's a little kiosk to purchase some little treats. And for about 2 hours, the whole community just kind of hangs out with one another. The kids play, and there were 4 guys that gathered at the same table every day and played some kind of card game or some kind of board game with one another. And there was this conversations that were happening in the community with one another. And I have to tell you, I was a little jealous of watching them for 2 hours interact. I mean, for 2 hours, everything just kind of halted, and they all came together, and they were just community with one another. And for most people in El Goral, they're not leaving somewhere else. They're spending their whole life in that community. These people they see are lifelong relationships of people they know that are relatives and those that are friends, but ultimately they are 58 households that are just one big giant family, and they share life with one another. And there's something beautiful about that. And I thought back in my life how segregated my life is in terms of work and family and neighborhood and things I'm interested in doing and places that I go, and how segregated my life is, and how much it would be a benefit to have this mutually supportive community that gathered every day, that shared and benefited from one another. Now, the book of Exodus, in the chapter 22 I read, is 2 chapters after the receiving of the 10 Commandments in Exodus. Chapter 20 is the receiving of the 10 Commandments. And then following that, there are several chapters of laws and regulations and various things that unfold following. You think of it, you got 10 commandments. You think it might take them a while to figure out the 10, but there's kind of a host of other laws and regulations that follow in the chapters that follow Exodus 20. And we get in chapter 22, and there's this piece about not charging interest for people if you give people some equity. Or if you borrow a piece of clothing, you give it back to them by the end of the day because it might be all they have. And at the end of that passage, we have God says, and I will be listening and respond with compassion to my people. And I think of that passage of not taking advantage of someone, or not taking something from someone that they might really need that. Maybe they'll let me use it for a little bit, but a lot of times we do a lot of taking and not a lot of giving back in the world, and the way I see the larger global economy and the way it works. In this Exodus story, this telling of various laws and regulations, and there's few little verses that talk about not taking advantage of the equity you give to someone. Don't charge interest. Don't make money off other people. Don't take things you can't give back to them. This passage in chapter 22 of Exodus is really part of a larger body of material in Exodus of reframing the mindset of people. They had come out of Egypt, where they had been enslaved for a long period of time. There was a sense that everything was contractual. Their whole life was not theirs. They were told when to work, where to sleep, what they could do, what they could not do. And coming out from that kind of context into a place of crossing over into a place of feeling like you're free, realizing that all that historical understanding of slavery would influence them in terms of how they would live as free people. Some theologians think that the wilderness time, they say they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. We hear the word 40 a lot. Usually 40 is typically a symbol in the Bible for a period of discernment to figure out a major transition in your life. 40 years, 40 days. We have the Noah story in 40 days. We have Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. We have lots of 40, all periods of discernment to figure out a major life transition. And this transition of wilderness was a time period to reshape the minds of these people, to help them rethink what it means to truly live in community with one another. The community they lived in Egypt was they were told what they could do, what they couldn't do, when they could rise and when they could sleep, when they could take a break or not from their hard labor. And this idea of God listening and God being compassionate and moving them out of, I'll do this for you if you do this for me, mentality. We sometimes have a hard time getting out of that mindset of how that works. In the very first church I served in seminary, I was an associate, and the senior minister had me receive and be mindful of all the people that walked into the church asking for assistance. And that was not the easiest thing to figure out, but he wanted to use it as a learning opportunity for me about how the world works and what's out there and how things are navigated. There was a young couple that came in for assistance, and they said they needed some food or they needed some gas money. They needed something to kind of help them out for the rest of the day. And I tend to be a little on the soft side, and whatever their story was, it maybe wasn't true, but I said, I'm going to give them about $25 to help them with some food and some gas. And they thanked me, and they said, can you pray for us? And we said a little prayer, and we prayed, and then they walked out the door to the right, and then there was a classroom, and they were going to have to walk around the building based on where they came from. And I went to a classroom, and there was a window next to that classroom. I could hear them walking along the outside of the church near the classroom. I had just given them $25, and I overheard them saying, well, that was the easiest $25 we got off anybody this week. He believes anything. I was like, oh my gosh, I just got taken. And you can imagine how that early on can callous you to response of things. And then there was a gentleman that came in a few weeks later, and he wanted some help with some food. And I was thinking, oh gosh, I got burned the last time. I'm not going to do this again. But he kind of told this story, and there was something about him that thought, yeah, I'm going to help him out a little. So I gave him $20 to help him out with a little food. And I said, now, Darnell, I can only help you this once. We don't really have a lot of money, but we can help you with we can help you with the food a little bit. I said, okay. He said, okay. About 2 weeks later, Darnell shows up again. And I said, Darnell, we don't have a lot of money. I just need just a little bit more. I'm trying to work on a job. I'm getting close. I need a little gas money. I need to get to this job interview. I've got a real opportunity to get this job. Can you give me like $20 for gas? Okay, Darnell, I'll give you $20 for gas, but this has got to be the last time. I can't help you anymore. So thank you. 2 weeks later, Darnell shows up. And I quickly stood up and said, Darnell, I've helped you twice. He says, I didn't come to ask for anything. I came to give you something today. And in his back pocket, he pulled out of his pocket this wadded up piece of paper. And he unfolded it and kind of tried to smooth it out. And I said, what are you doing? He goes, well, I had to write all this stuff on a piece of paper. I couldn't remember it all. I wrote you a song. And he a cappella sings me a song and sings it right to me there in the office. And I said, what inspired you to do that? Because we're the only person that listened to me and helped. And you gave me food and you gave me gas, and now I have a job. I don't have a lot to give back, but I thought I had a pretty good voice. I could give you my song. And so he sang me a song. I mean, talk about dismantling the callousness and all that stuff. Darnell kind of broke through all of that and kind of made me reimagine again what it means to live in mutual relationship with one another. It's not about giving and taking and I'll do this for you and you do this for me. There's this genuine peeling back what we see in someone and seeing the heart of a person and how important it is to see the heart of a person. Now, Eugenio will know this name as Gustavo Gutierrez. You'll know him. Liberation theology person. Is kind of the birth of liberation theology. It's coming out of Central and South America. And one of the things that Gustavo Gutierrez talks about is in his theology of liberation theology is an option for the poor. That everything that we do is seen through the lens of the poor. Because Gustavo said every time that Jesus Christ responded in his ministry, it was in favor of those who had the very least in their life and trying to build them up for them to see the potential of who they could be in the world, because the rest of the world minimized their experience and minimized their humanity and minimized who they thought they could be, and Jesus gave them another opportunity to see the potential in themselves that God saw in them. So Gustavo Gutierrez says our theology should be seen through the lens of the poor. It should be an option for the poor. He actually claims more of what I would call a theology of the neighbor. And Stacy did such a beautiful job today with the kids of thinking about who our neighbor is, who needs to be drawn into our circle. And often our circle is never wide enough. And about the time we think we've figured out where our circle is, we have to draw it a little wider. I know there's a well-known song that we sing here, Draw the Circle Wide. It was just keep expanding the circle. At some point, our circle just kind of has to have porous little openings in the end of our circle. Whatever biggest circle we could imagine we put out there, it has to have porous openings in it because we have to allow ourselves for our circle to be bigger than whatever our biggest conception might be. And the greatest thing for me as I look through some of these passages of Exodus, this reimagining and reformulating the mind, the person, of how I'm supposed to live in community with one another, how I'm supposed to live in solidarity with one another. H. Richard Niebuhr, in his book, The Responsible Self, says that to be the most responsible self possible, his fourth category of being the responsible self is solidarity with others. It's in community with others that the best self isn't just me, myself, and I. My best self is when I'm connected and interconnected with other people in my life from different life experiences. And yet we look at our world and we have set up situations that we segregate one another. I think of corporations and corporations that pay individuals, especially those on the lowest scale of earnings. What do we call people that earn the least? What do they earn? Minimum wage. It's what a boss can pay. The least amount I can get away with, I'll pay them. And there's been a movement, Stand Up KC in Kansas City and Missouri on the Kansas side has been fighting for not only minimum wage, but moving up at least to $15 an hour. But I would say we should push for a living wage. Someone that makes minimum wage in Kansas $7.25 an hour, gross makes $15,000 a year. That's not Social Security withholdings being taken out. I mean, they can basically, with their annual earnings, maybe pay for rent alone for the year. That doesn't include car and food and gas and all the other things we can imagine that you'd put into your budget. Minimum wage maybe covers your housing only for the year. It's interesting that we call those at the bottom of the spectrum of wage earnings minimum wage. I think back to this Exodus 22. Don't take advantage of people. And if you take something from someone, give it back to them because they're going to need it at some point. As I think back to my experience in El Garal, I started out with. Sometimes we get a glimpse of what God's beloved community is like in a place we least expected to see it. I caught a glimpse of it in El Salvador last January, just a glimpse. And we would visit there and think, gosh, dirt floors, 10 by 10 structures, limited education, limited resources. And by the end of the week, I didn't see any of those things. I just saw people that loved one another and cared for one another and found joy in their life. Sometimes when we think we're seeing the poor, we actually see a window into who God is and what God expects of us as human beings. Sometimes we discover God through the poor when we least expect it.